Disney Pixar's Elemental is a strong, varied entry in a recent catalog of films to come to its Disney Plus live internet subscription service. The film is obviously created for children, but it has a certain quality to it that drew no small amount of interest when it was first teased online. Originally, the film was only available in theaters, which meant if the neurotic homebodies of the world wanted to watch a kids' film and talk about it to their YouTube audiences, we were going to have to wait a little bit. We could also tweet about it ignorantly without ever going to see it, judging it based on a few viral clips, but if we did that, we wouldn't ever be able to know if the film had a serious problem. Confusingly, the film also appeared to flop at first, massively underperforming at the box office, until it recovered and did end up making Disney Pixar a decent amount of money. There's probably some interesting statistical analysis to be done, cross-referencing theater and online release dates with how the film was marketed, but ultimately I'd say this one wasn't a sensation or a flop. It ultimately just landed on its feet and wobbled a bit before regaining its balance. No biggie. Let's back up a bit. What is the film actually about? Well, we start off seeing our main character, Ember, as her parents arrive to Element City and make a home to raise her in. There are a couple details in this sequence that I'd like to touch on later, but for now it's all set up. Ember develops a place in her father's shop, which we are repeatedly told she will inherit, but she has a problem. She's frustrated all the time with her duties in the shop, eventually in anticipation of a big step forward where her father lets her run a major sale all by herself, as he feels ready for retirement and wants her to be equally ready. A pipe bursts in the basement and Ember meets a water person, our male lead, Wade. The two are intrigued by the sudden rush of water to Firetown and attempt to investigate after Wade, who is a city inspector, writes up Ember's shop and they need to chase down the ticket. On the way, we meet some other characters from other elements, including Gale, who we meet in a stadium as we get to see the other elements interact during a sports game. The three bond, and Gale gives Wade and Ember a few days to figure out the water problem in exchange for voiding the ticket. Along the way, Wade and Ember use their unique talents to set right the water leak, first with sandbags and then with melted glass from the sand. They get to know each other during this period and then hit it off so well that they spark some romantic tension, pun not intended. Ember meets Wade's family, who have a sort of soft bigotry towards her on the basis of her background as a fire person, but who ultimately affirm her unique talents. Wade confesses his feelings, and the two begin a secretive relationship on the basis that Ember's parents don't approve of Wade's background, even as Ember's father begins to pass the family shop on to her. Wade has various encounters with Ember's family, such as her father tormenting him with spicy food, or her mother gauging the connection between Ember and Wade with a kind of cultural ritual unique to fire people. Ember realizes she doesn't want the shop, but is torn between her dreams and familial duty. Gale and Wade prepare a special surprise for Ember involving a rare flower she was unable to see as a child, and Wade and Ember share a series of intimate moments. Ember then dumps Wade in order to stay true to her family, but just as Ember's father is announcing his retirement, Wade appears and declares his feelings for her openly. Distraught, Ember's father comes back out of retirement immediately. However, the dam of glass that Ember and Wade erected shatters, and Firetown is flooded. Wade arrives to help Ember save her family's cultural artifact that they brought from their country of origin, and in the process the two become trapped. Wade evaporates due to the heat in the enclosed space, and after being rescued, Ember confesses to her parents that she loved Wade and didn't want to run the shop after all. Wade, however, has survived in the moisture above the room. And when Ember makes him cry, he drips back down to join the family. Wade and Ember get together with the approval of their families, and they both leave Element City so Ember can pursue her new line of work in glassmaking. Now that's a lot of recap, but I felt it necessary to do that here to try to catch everyone up to speed with the film's plot so we can all locate the core of the story together. There are, as I see it, two key conflicts in the narrative, those being the conflicts of the elements and the conflicts of the families. Crucially, Ember is the core of both of these conflicts. This is true in the sense that Wade's family is casually racist to her family is actively hostile to Wade, and her tension with taking over her father's work motivates her own difficulties in her relationship with Wade. It is also true, however, in the sense that Elemental is told from and only allegorically scans as an Asian immigrant story. Element City itself is modeled on a number of real cities with large multiracial populations, but the story of Ember's parents coming from their homeland across the sea to a new world with other groups of people mainly makes sense as an allegory for Asian American immigration to the west coast of the United States of America. Ember's family specifically draws on Asian and Asian American cultural concepts and artifacts, such as the bow Ember and her father share, or the accents of Ember's parents, or the use of Firetown as a parallel to real and existing Chinatown and Koreatown locations. The other elements don't really have a strong singular analog in any real racial group, which is interesting because it simultaneously limits the potential of the commentary, but also presents a really condensed narrative struggle. I used the words racist and multiracial earlier, and I do think that race and the family are the two key ways of breaking down the conflict in this film. It is, essentially, a young woman's story about struggling in love and struggling in her career, but race and the family unit are the sources of conflict that generate that struggle. Ember brings it all together as a protagonist. The story mainly makes sense from her position and her parents' positions, as Element City is a kind of Flanderization of what a lot of real cities with multiracial immigrant populations are like. There's a sequence in the film that portrays the origins of Element City, where one presumably native group founds the city, and then there are two subsequent waves of immigrants who arrive in a friendly fashion, presumably prior to the Fire People. The earlier waves of immigrants seem to have little to no discrimination that we see, and they are welcomed and accommodated to the best of our knowledge in a harmonious fashion. It is the Fire People in particular who are discriminated against. Alright, now here comes the tough part. I am going to advance the criticism that this film is essentially racist, and I need you all to not lose your minds. I think this is, otherwise, a well-made children's film with a sweet and affirming message. That might sound contradictory, but I don't think it is. Ember's struggle to understand her own desires, her struggle to be understood by her parents, and her struggle to find her place in the world are reflections of real issues that real children watching this film will face, and I think the lesson is a good one. It's important for her to believe in herself and struggle for harmony with other people in her social relationships and her lifestyle, just as it is for us. I've also known Asian Americans as well as people of other racial backgrounds who specifically have spoken to the demands on them to help their family and their economic situation and give up on their private dreams. This all seems to speak to a real experience that the director, Peter Sohn, really had, and expressing that real human trust is important. The issue I have is one that's come up time and time again in media, and I've started noticing it more and more. When you have racial allegories, it's important to think through what you're creating, because you're effectively portraying a certain way of seeing race as a concept and races. None of the portrayal of the four elements is unkind, so at a surface level this commentary works, but on a deeper level something is off about this. Fantasy fiction in general has a similar problem, but usually there's a human race that contains associated cultures and appearances and racial markers. At best, you're left with an intentionally non-allegorical reading with implicit bigotries, like The Lord of the Rings, something I touched on in this month's Patreon essay, actually. And at worst, you get something like The Elder Scrolls or World of Warcraft. Actually, World of Warcraft's racial elements are kind of their own insane dimension to this conversation, but the point is that this happens a lot. But Elemental doesn't have a human race as a kind of partial out to this problem, so in a way it's even less subtle. Because the elements are basically organized into Asian and everyone else, which admittedly, from a statistical standpoint on the level of the global population carries some water, pun intended, the narrative isn't suited to speaking to other injustices. In, for example, real multiracial cities in the United States of America, the history of races mixing prior to the arrival of massive numbers of Asian immigrants wasn't exclusively harmonious, to say the least, and the occurrence of racial segregation in housing isn't a quirky, artsy design feature, but rather the product of the reinforcement of grave social injustices towards real racial minorities. In the film, Ember's father's treatment of Wade is positioned as wrong, but in the world of Element City, he doesn't have any power over Wade, whose voice actor is black but whose element isn't a consistent stand-in for any one race, outside of that one avenue. Meanwhile, in the real world, anti-black sentiment in Asian American communities is a real problem, and the reverse isn't always a happy story either. This is a children's film, and so its opportunity for depth and coverage of racial issues is limited, but it's also teaching children a certain framing for understanding race. In Elemental, we're shown that it's wrong to judge someone for their elemental or racial background, and we are given to understand the elements or races as biologically innately different, in ways both subjective and insurmountable. For example, Wade and Ember prove that elements can mix by producing a boiling effect when they touch. It's a nice play on the idea of couples having chemistry, and it really thwarts the idea that the elements or races either can't or shouldn't mix. At this point in the film, I felt the director was really onto something. For a moment, this really threatened to verge into anti-racist art, and while I'd call it racially progressive in relative terms, I wouldn't go that far. I think what a director with either a more ambitious imagination or more likely a more permissive studio backing him would have done in that instance is attempt to undermine the assumptions of the audience. We've seen that the different elements think of themselves as different, but what if the mechanics in the film were reworked to show that they actually aren't? Race is, when you get right down to it, a spurious and unscientific way of categorizing human beings based mostly on outward-facing characteristics like appearance or cultural aspects. It isn't all that insightful for really understanding someone, and after films like Inside Out have showed Pixar's ability to break down social problems on the level of perception, I really think this film could have used the same treatment, as opposed to going for the Zootopia or Lion King angle. When people make generalizations about the core traits of a person based on their racial background, we're right to call that racism, as it reinforces the same colonial social framing that has worked from its modern origin to the current day to justify the oppression of millions and millions of people worldwide. But Pixar has created a world where biological racism is real. In effect, this is race realism, and it's ideologically ugly. There's not even really any plausible deniability either, because the allegory is obvious and deliberate, and there's no juxtaposition of humanity with non-human races to have a kind of species-related use of the concept, even as a flimsy deflection. In a way, Elemental is an example of how progressive ideas can work to reinforce the ideological frameworks that generated the very conditions they claim to stand against. And that just won't do. For one thing, it teaches progressive-minded people to think on racist terms, but for another, it yields a lot of ground to racists on an ideological level. I don't mean this in terms of accepting racist premises this time, but actually in terms of presenting a failed alternative to racist views. Element City's origin story tells a lie on that allegorical level. It presents a past that doesn't fit with the story's trappings or its real-world equivalents. Because this film unsuccessfully refutes racist ideas, it also falls short of being able to present an alternative. A racist, and usually a far-righter, gets to point to that part of the film where we see the elements coming together in harmony and say, that's not realistic, real racial conflict doesn't work like that, and despite being the inheritor of an insane ideology, they get to be right when they say that. A pretty lie about racism always yields itself to an uglier lie that gets presented by the opportunistic reactionaries as a horrible truth. But we are not choosing between the horrible and the pretty here, only the true and the false, when we choose anti-racism over racism. The truth is that history is marked by racism in many ways, and that history can be thwarted, it can be combated, it can be defeated, but it cannot be escaped and it cannot be successfully ignored. Our past is racist. Our future must be anti-racist. That anti-racism can serve people of every race, but racism serves no race. And that fact is something that I think Elemental does observe quite well. I only wish that in the future we could escape these inadequate ways of understanding and treating our fellow human beings. In that future, different people can develop new ways of seeing and understanding each other, and they can live in harmony. But until the weight of our past is shattered by that oncoming future, there will be no escape for real human beings from race or racism. Maybe that oncoming blaze of revolution begins with a single ember kept lit from generation to generation. Or maybe that oncoming tide of the recognition of human dignity rises from many ripples, swelling as one. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, I have more on my channel about media and politics, and more in the works to come. You can catch me live on Twitch, support my work on Patreon to get some special exclusives, or simply subscribe here for more. Remember to give this video a like and comment to tell me how cute I am, and I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.